Okay. Good morning.
Morning.
Welcome, Maddie. You can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. For the record, Maddie Kempner, Policy Director at the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont. Thanks for having me today to testify on H706. NOFA Vermont supports this bill and the phasing out of neonicotinoids for agricultural and other uses in Vermont. Our mission at NOFA is to promote organic practices to build an economically viable, ecologically sound, and socially just Vermont agricultural system that benefits all living things. The widespread and prophylactic use of neonics goes against that mission and our values regarding health, respect for farmers, stewardship, and education. As you've heard through other testimony this session and previously, neonics harm soil health, birds, pollinators, and by extension, organic farmers. The evidence is very clear that neonicotinoids are causing harm to bees, birds, and aquatic life. And there are also numerous studies demonstrating neonicotinoids' negative impact on soil organisms. This harm is not only problematic for ecosystem health as a whole, but also directly threatens the health and viability of organic farms in particular. Organic agriculture functions on the basic principle of working as much as possible with natural systems rather than against them, or rather than supplanting them. Organic farmers rely on healthy living soil and help from beneficial insects and pest predators, such as birds, to grow healthy crops. The organic regulations actually require organic farmers to use practices that maintain or improve the condition of the soil, as well as practices that support biodiversity. What this looks like on the ground is a farmer planting a hedgerow that can serve as habitat for birds that prey on pest populations and as forage for bees that pollinate their crops. Below ground, a diversity of soil life forms serves a similar function of keeping pest and disease pressure down while providing nutrients to crops. This is accomplished using practices like cover cropping, green manures, composting, and crop rotations. Particularly in a place like Vermont, where our land base is small, organic and conventional farms are often side by side, and the persistent negative impact of neonicotinoids on soil life, birds, and bees actively works against organic farmers and lots of others who may not be certified organic, but who also rely on these species for their own farming systems to succeed. In conventional systems, practices like cover cropping and crop rotations are thankfully becoming more common as the importance of soil health is better understood. Unfortunately, this growing emphasis on soil health has so far not extended to moving away from the widespread use of harmful inputs like neonics. This may be starting to change, however, as we see neighbors in Canada and New York enacting policies to phase them out. Thanks in part to those policy changes, we now know that it's possible to farm without the use of neonics, even in conventional systems. As you, I think, have heard, UVM Extension and the Vermont Bee Lab held a webinar on January 23rd, 2024, where a panel of Quebec farmers shared their experience of transitioning away from neonic-treated seeds following the ban passed there in 2019. I just want to pause here and say, if you have not watched the webinar, I really encourage you to take a moment to watch it. It's about an hour long. And I would also encourage you to invite farmers who participated in that panel or the agronomist who was part of that webinar to come and speak to your committee directly. We learned a lot from the farmers in that webinar who shared about their experience. And a lot of what we learned is all of the messaging that we receive from industry and folks who don't want to see these seed treatments phased out, that might not be correct. So contrary to the messaging we've heard for years from seed suppliers and others that moving to seed not treated with neonics will lead to decreased yields or worse, crop failure, the Quebec farmers shared that they saw no impact to their yields when they switched to non-neonic treated seed. In fact, many of the farmers we heard from had moved away from insecticide treatments altogether with no negative impact on yield. These outcomes align with several pieces of research that we have now, including EPA's findings as far back as 2014, more recent research from Cornell demonstrating that neonic coatings on corn, soy, and other seed provide little or no economic benefit to farmers, and the initial data from Heather Darby's research here in Vermont. In the run-up to Quebec's passage of its neonic ban back in 2019, companies went so far as to claim that implementing this policy would lead to the collapse of the grain sector in Quebec. In reality, the impact of the neonic ban on farmers has been so minimal that few, if any, farmers have even chosen to use the exemption process provided by the law to acquire treated seed. Another message we hear from industry is that seed companies will be unable or unwilling to provide seed not treated with neonics. One of the farmers participating in the webinar emphasized that while this message was also pervasive in Quebec, leading up to the passage of the ban. His experience has been that, in fact, seed companies do have the ability to turn around and provide untreated seed very quickly, and that messaging around the lack of availability of untreated seed is a scare tactic. Finally, we often hear from seed companies that untreated seed will be more expensive for farmers. In fact, the Quebec farmers participating in the January webinar shared that it often costs between $10 and $20 Canadian less per bag than treated seed. The farmers did note that some shifts in practices were needed. Crop rotations, for example, have been very important to break pest cycles, as is waiting a little bit longer than usual to plant in the spring. One farmer specifically mentioned waiting until his organic neighbors were planting as a good indicator of when the timing would be right for him, given that organic farmers need to wait for optimal planting conditions since their seeds aren't treated with fungicide or insecticide. When Heather Darby testified before your committee last week, she shared a story about attending a meeting where it was announced that neonic treated seed would no longer be optional. It should alarm us that seed companies have taken away farmers' choices in this way, and that these companies have used this lack of farmer choice to grow their profits, while we all bear the cost of persistent systemic pesticides in our environment. We do not have to continue to accept this as a status quo, and we're learning from the experience of our neighbors that it doesn't have to be. We know Vermont supports the passage of H706. We thank the committee for taking up this bill and recognizing that we are at a turning point in understanding that our farmers and Vermont as a whole can make a different choice.
Okay, you've left some time for questions, so Representative Tumpkin.
Of the alternative practices that the Quebecois farmers had to adopt, were any of them substitute chemical practices that would also be worrisome?
Not from what we heard in the webinar. That was granted, like, it's a small sample size. It was 4 farmers and an agronomist, but from what we heard, they were largely able to transition away from insecticide use altogether, with little or no impact.
And was there legislation that, details that made that easier? Or, I mean, was there some kind of component to the law that encouraged the farmer to move away from those practices, or did it happen more naturally?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, one thing that they mentioned in the webinar that I would love to learn more details about and share with you is that there's also an insurance program in Quebec that pays farmers $18 an acre to not use insecticides. So I think that, what they found in terms of the cost savings around purchasing non-treated seed in combination with that actual payment that they receive, which is not insubstantial if you're planting a large acreage, is a really meaningful incentive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, and I realize that you're just reporting what you heard.
Yes.
But did you hear that there was no loss in yield as opposed to not an economic loss, taking into account, for example, insurance payments or the cost differential between treated and untreated seeds?
Mostly, my recollection is mostly what they talked about in the webinar was no loss of yield, which obviously translates to economic loss in some way.
Representative Levitt.
Oh, I was just curious, are these statistics the same for corn and for soybeans, or do we just have stats for corn?
Great question. I believe the Quebec farmers are all corn growers. Yeah, so I'm not positive about the stats being the same on corn. But the EPA statistic that I mentioned from 2014, basically they're finding that it had little to no effect on yield, was related to soybean seed in particular.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Wilson.
Why did they use neonicotinoids in the first place then?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I would say for Heather Darby, who was in last week, there are certain pest populations that I think, these treatments can be effective at mitigating. To us, the bigger problem is this shift to prophylactic use. The fact that now 99% of corn and soybean seed comes treated and that farmers don't have the option to not use it, is the piece that's really problematic. And also to imagine the systemic and long-term impact of that use on the health of soil organisms, not only in the fields where they're being planted, but like neonics have been found in forest soils that are, miles away from anywhere that neonics have actually ever been planted. So there is, there's a difference between a tool that might be necessary for a farmer to use occasionally to address really significant pest pressure, and But what we have now is a situation where this pesticide use, I think honestly, oftentimes what farmers get into is sort of the chemical treadmill, right? Where they become so reliant on these chemicals that once they go without them, the defense mechanisms that are sort of naturally inherent in healthy soil have been worn down so much that they can't withstand any kind of natural pest cycle. And that's sort of the idea in organic systems, not that all of these farmers are going to transition to organic, but that you essentially use crop rotations and other kind of non-chemical methods to break those cycles rather than just suppressing them year after year after year without seeing if you actually really need them.
We had testimony in earlier this week about golf courses that use them one time per year. They said it was highly regulated, but is that the problem for farmers? Is it, or neonics just a problem wherever they're used?
I mean, I would say yes to my testimony, to the purpose of my testimony, which is really like, part of my role is to speak on behalf of organic farmers. I would say that in general, neonic use in the environment affects organic producers in the same way, whether it's on a golf course or on a cornfield.
Yeah, these aren't necessarily most of the time not near farming, though. The wind blows.
The wind blows, and the thing that we found is that they persist for a long time, and they also spread to places where they haven't actually been directly applied. So even if they're sprayed on a golf course, that contamination can spread to other parts of the environment really readily and can last a long time.
Representative Cole.
And rather than just the wind blowing too, which is another factor, but also the bees move. So, the bees
Yeah.
are vectors and they, wherever they are picking it up, of course, that affects bees everywhere. So
Yeah.
it doesn't matter where.
Absolutely. And one of the things about organic production too is it's very, very difficult to have certified organic honey for that reason, because bees travel, I think, an average of 5 miles or something from their home hive. So in a place like Vermont, at least, where our land base is relatively small, and most people don't own that much acreage, it's really challenging for a honey producer to be certified organic because the bees do travel. The other thing that is, obviously an important consideration to think about when it comes to these chemicals and how they move is water. And we're finding some kind of alarming studies actually coming out of Europe right now about the level of contamination in water, even in residential areas, because the neonicotinoids are also used in pet treatments, like in flea and tick treatments. And so a lot of that chemical ends up washing into the rivers and harming aquatic life, as I mentioned.
Representative Templeman.
Does NOFA have a manual of recommended practices for golf courses, or a certification for golf courses, or some
Yeah.
sort of interface with their practices, and maybe extend that beyond golf courses to, landscape management?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we actually in Vermont have not done as much of that kind of organic land care, but our partners in Connecticut, the Connecticut chapter of NOFA, do a lot with organic land care and do a lot of education and workshops, I think, with, primarily homeowners, but they might do some education for golf courses as well. We haven't really focused on that here in Vermont, but it's a good question.
Representative O'Brien.
In the unintended consequences category, we've heard of the family of diamide chemicals. Pesticides is an alternative to neonics. So where's NOFA on this? If we ban neonics, the Monsantos of the world may shift to a diamide.
Yeah.
The corn and soybean farmers would be following the letter of the law, but have a new pesticide.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's always a possibility that we definitely recognize. And that's part of the reason that I really wanted to highlight this issue of farmer choice and education, right? Like the fact that these pesticides are used prophylactically, and that farmers, and what I've heard actually indirectly in conversation with Heather Darby is that like farmers don't even necessarily know what their seeds are coated with. They're just sort of sold these seeds that come with all these various treatments, some of which might be more necessary. Like you've heard probably Heather testify on the importance of fungicides in some cases. Some of which are, maybe entirely unnecessary. I would say with something like that, I would hope, and maybe there are steps that the legislature could take to require there to be, education for farmers were they to be pushed towards some other pesticide use, that they're really getting training through their pesticide applicator licensing on, the negative impacts of those pesticides, because likely there will be some.
questions?
Just one more. We had a orchardist in Sunrise Orchard
Yeah.
and they use it 4 times a year.
Mhm.
Going for apple maggot and, very, very much targeted. But felt it was an important tool. So where's NOFA on our orchards?
I mean, we do hear oftentimes that growing apples, for example, is really challenging to do in fully in an organic system. I know that there are certain practices that are used by orchardists that are not necessarily allowed in organic certification. I would say, again, going back to making sure that we have strict, regulations around educating producers about when those pesticides can be used. The one thing that's a little tricky about neonics, oftentimes, and I think even in this bill, or previous versions of this bill, maybe there was stipulations around the timing of use, right? And timing it, timing applications to be before blooming, for example. That only goes so far in this case because they're so persistent. So I think even an orchardist who's using it 4 times a year, at hopefully well-timed intervals that would be less damaging in theory to pollinators and bees, are still going to do long-term damage because these things persist in the environment and the bees are still going to be taking them up in other ways. So that's one thing that I find challenging about trying to time the application of this. Feels like it's not the point entirely. Yeah.
Do you have as NOFA members, apple growers in the state who are organic?
That's a good question. I don't know if we have any certified organic apple growers these days. We did when I first started at NOFA like 10 years ago. We had an orchard who was certified organic. We might have folks who are members who are not necessarily certified. Not all of the NOFA members are certified organic farmers. But I can look into that for you and see if someone would want to come in and testify. It would be interesting.
Another question I had was about organic corn. So whether there are of the 120 or so organic dairies that are still in Vermont, I know some of them are producing grass-fed milk.
Yeah.
Presumably others are not.
Yeah.
Are they growing organic corn or feed corn?
Yeah, a few, not many. Most folks I think are buying in their grain rations who are certified organic. There's a few, I think Earl Ransom down at Stratford Organic Creamery is one who, at least last I knew, was growing his own corn. So he would be a good person to hear from. Yeah, but many are grass-fed or buying in their grain.
And then there's also language in the bill that we haven't taken any testimony on applying the neonic pesticides to vegetable crops.
Mm-hmm.
So leafy vegetable, I'm reading from the text here, leafy vegetables, bulb vegetables, brassica, which might be Brussels sprouts, I'm not sure.
Yeah, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower.
Herbs, spices, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering what organic farmers use instead to make sure that they have a healthy crop at the end of the season.
Yeah, they use crop rotations primarily, I would say. I mean, there are some organic approved insecticides that people can rely on. And the idea in organic production is that there are treatments that folks can use ideally as a last resort. And that basically you're preventing pests by rotating your crops and by having a diverse set of crops. I have actually spoken to folks with UVM Extension who have shared that, neonics are certainly used for vegetable seeds in commercial systems. I would say what I've heard directly from those folks actually is that the number of commercial conventional vegetable producers who would really be impacted by this is on the order of like 3. A lot of our vegetable producers in Vermont are actually certified organic. And so I don't think that the impact on vegetable growers as a whole would be as high as it would be on, corn and soy growers, for example.
Other questions?
Here's one.
Yeah.
This is, I guess, sort of it's organic NOFA question in your world is that, do you interact with this orchardist, was following like this Red Tomato is a eco protocol sort of organization that's, I guess, lesser than organic, but
Yeah.
still aware of these things. And
Yeah.
so how does NOFA work with groups like Red Tomato?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do know a little bit about Red Tomato, and I think their approach tends to be more in like the IPM category, which frankly, like I would like to see a lot more of that. You know, I think we don't necessarily expect, especially for certain crops where it might be really challenging for various reasons, for, you know, every farmer to be certified organic, but to use that IPM approach, which again, prophylactic use on 99% of treated seed or 99% of seed really goes against the IPM philosophy. I don't know how much we've directly worked with Red Tomato, but I will say we do work in our farmer services program with folks who are not certified organic who want to learn about how to use more organic friendly or climate friendly practices. And actually, that's one thing that's important to know that I think might be helpful to this effort right now too, is that there is actually a lot of money from USDA for the first time that I'm aware of ever, to support folks taking up more organic practices. So there's a new, through NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they now have an organic practice standard where folks can go to their NRCS office and actually get payments to switch to organic practices. There's also a program called USDA that we're participating in called the TOP program. It's the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. So there's money in that program to help, again, support folks in developing markets. There's money for mentorship with certified organic farmers for folks who are interested in transitioning. So there are more resources out there now than like ever before to support people who want to take up more organic practices. And even at NOFA, we're actually currently building out an organic practices team that is really squarely focused on supporting farmers and using more organic and climate resilient practices on the ground, because our farmer services work historically is focused on kind of business planning and marketing support and other kinds of technical assistance. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to learn right now.
Does that seem like it's gonna go forward in the next farm bill?
It's what's already happening. It's already been started. So USDA invested, I think it was 300 million last year. That was the beginning of the TOP partnership. It's called, and the broader umbrella is called the Organic Transition Initiative. There is a bill that's been proposed that Senator Welch put forward for the next farm bill called the Opportunities in Organic Program. That would basically institutionalize and make permanent some of those funding mechanisms, so that it can be a really ongoing effort. That bill would also increase the certification reimbursement that people get through the cost share program. It would double that, which would be really, really beneficial for organic farmers too.
What does IPM mean? I apologize for typing late.
Yeah, sorry, the acronyms, integrated pest management. It's basically a system of managing pests that, you know, again, relies on pesticides as more of a last resort. Yeah.
Maddie, we heard testimony, I think it was when the Ag Innovation Board came and reported a week or so ago that seeds, conventional treated seeds needed to be ordered in the fall. And I'm wondering, do you have a sense, and maybe this is a question for an organic farmer, somebody who's growing corn, whether the timing is similar if you're planting organically? Do you need to order that far in advance?
I would think so. I would think the ordering would be similar, and it would be a good question for, you know, Earl, if we can get another farmer in. The other thing that came up in the webinar was, you know, the availability of seed question was obviously something that was highlighted. And one of the growers did mention that like 10 years ago, it was challenging to get untreated seed. Like, you know, but that's long before this ban actually was even instituted in Quebec. So, you know, it's not, I think, you know, there might be some growing pains if we pass this policy around companies being prepared to turn around that seed, but it doesn't sound like it's going to be the hurdle that we often hear it will be.
Do you have any insight into whether the same companies that sell seed in Canada also sell in this country?
That also came up in the webinar a little bit. And some of the companies are the same, like Pioneer is a big seller of seed in Canada as they are here. It sounded like there may be some differences in the actual seed treatment processes that are happening in Canada. Like some of their co-ops are actually doing the seed treatment themselves. Being in the organic world, I don't know as much about that process and the companies here. But it would, yeah, it'd be worth looking into.
Not seeing any other hands. All right. Well, thank you very much for
Thank you.
coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So, before we'll take maybe 5 minutes just to transition, but before we do that, anybody have any immediate thoughts you want to share? We'll let it brew for 5 minutes then.